Arizona Territory, 1877. They dragged her through the dirt by the wrists, her dress torn and face streaked with dust and dried blood. The sun beat down hard and still no one looked her in the eye. Except one man. Lorna Tate stumbled as they pulled her toward the post where the others waited. She heard one of them mutter, "Run away." Another spat near her feet. The commander of Fort Bowie stood tall and tight-jawed by the gallows as two privates began checking the rope. Lorna's lips were cracked. She did not speak. Not yet. She had run. And she had been caught. That was enough for them. Behind the gathered soldiers and settlers, atop a chestnut horse, sat a man with long black hair tied with a strip of hide. He wore simple leather and a faded blue army jacket that hung off his shoulders like it meant nothing. His name was Setah Kola, one of the Apache scouts hired by the army. But he had not come for them. He had come for her. Lorna saw him just as they shoved her to her knees. Her eyes locked with his, and something in her chest tight and burning loosened. She had not seen him in over 5 years. Not since they were teenagers and he'd taught her how to track deer in the Chiricahua Hills long before everything fell apart. The fort commander stepped forward. "Lorna Tate, you deserted your assigned post. Fled while under contract as a field nurse. You stole a cavalry horse and disappeared for 4 days. That is desertion in wartime. The penalty is death." "I did not desert," her voice rasped, dry as bone. "I ran to survive." No one moved. A crow called in the distance. The gallows creaked in the wind. The commander waved her off. "You will be hanged at noon." Setah's voice rang across the yard. "She is no deserter." The hush that followed was sharp. Heads turned. The commander squinted up at him. "You have something to say, Apache?" Setah dismounted and walked past the soldiers like he was walking through fog. Lorna stared at him, her throat tight. He stopped beside her, looking down not in pity, but with fire. "She ran because she was being attacked," he said, "by one of your men. Lieutenant Breyer followed her into the supply house after dark. She fought him and fled. I tracked her." "I saw the blood." Murmurs spread fast. Breyer, a tall, blond officer, stepped back from the crowd. "You lie," the commander hissed. Setah's voice stayed steady. "I do not lie. I found her 2 days out half-conscious near the rocks past the dry riverbed. She was bleeding. I carried her back." Lorna's eyes welled, not from fear now, but from the way he stood beside her like a wall. Like no one would touch her again. The commander fumed. "Breyer has served with distinction." Setah cut him off. "Check his tent." The commander hesitated, then barked, "Search it." 2 soldiers ran off. The crowd murmured louder. Breyer tried to leave, but Setah stepped in front of him. A minute later, the soldiers returned. One held a torn piece of Lorna's dress. The other had a bloodied cavalry knife. The commander's face fell. He looked at Breyer, then at Setah, and finally at Lorna. "You said nothing," he said to her. Lorna looked up, voice low. "Because last time I tried to speak, you told me women lie." They cut her ropes. Setah reached forward, slow and careful, and helped her stand. She wobbled, but he did not let go. The commander cleared his throat. "Breyer will be held for court-martial. Miss Tate, you are free to go." She swayed, then stepped closer to Setah. "I have nowhere to go." He met her eyes. "Then come with me." They rode east, away from the fort and the gallows, into the hills where the air smelled like pine and dust. Lorna sat side-saddle on Setah's horse, too weak to ride on her own. He held the reins, his arm pressed gently to her back to keep her steady. They did not speak much. They did not need to. That night, they made camp beneath a bluff. Setah built a fire, his hands quick and silent. Lorna sat with her knees pulled close, his blanket around her shoulders. She watched him move steady, calm, the same way he had moved years ago when they were 16 and she had followed him like a shadow, eager to learn everything he knew. "You remembered me," she said softly. Setah did not look at her, just stirred the fire. "I never forgot you." She blinked fast. "I thought you were gone. After my father died, they sent me to the fort to work. I thought you had left. I came back and you were gone," he said. They told me you had married a soldier. She laughed once, bitter. They told me you had been killed. Silence stretched between them. Setah finally turned toward her. I looked for you. But the world is wide. And cruel. She nodded, her throat thick. Then she asked what had burned in her chest since that afternoon. Why did you speak for me? You did not have to. He looked at her, then really looked. I knew you once. I trusted you once. And when I saw you on your knees in the dust, I knew I still did. Lorna's breath caught. He was only a few feet away, but the space between them felt like nothing. She whispered, I would have died if not for you. Setah leaned forward, slow and sure, and took her hand. Then live. With me. Her tears fell quietly, and she nodded. He squeezed her hand once. We will make a new place. Far from gallows and lies. And in the soft firelight she believed him. By the fourth day, the bruises on her ribs had begun to yellow, and Lorna could sit straighter in the saddle. They traveled northeast through the foothills, keeping to dry washes and deer trails far from the roads the army used. Insects filled the air at dusk, and the scent of creosote came on the breeze after sundown. Setah led without speaking unless it was needed, pointing out a washout, a brittle rock, a place where the wind curled strangely. Lorna followed his lead, watching the way he read the land with the same quiet certainty he had once shown while laying snares or trailing javelina. They shared a meal of roasted mesquite beans and jerked venison by a cold spring that evening. She chewed slowly, her body still sore from the days of riding. Setah handed her a canteen, then crouched by the water's edge, washing his hands in the moonlight. You move like you've never been afraid of anything, she said. He looked up, not startled, just curious. I have been afraid, but not of men. She folded her hands around the canteen. When I was a girl, I thought you were part of the land, like a hawk or a tree. I didn't think you could be hurt. Even hawks bleed, he said, brushing water from his fingers. Even trees fall. She smiled faintly, then grew quiet. I saw a man die once. My first winter at the fort. Frostbitten so bad he couldn't feel the axe. He cut through his own thumb by accident and it festered. They buried him behind the mess tent. No one spoke his name again. Setah sat beside her, his legs crossed. They do not teach you how to hold grief in those places. Only how to bury it. Lorna nodded, eyes on the fire. I took to sewing wounds because it was the one thing I could do where no one told me to shut up. I wasn't much good at it at first. But I kept trying, even when my hands shook. He didn't reach for her, just listened. I don't know how to live anywhere that doesn't hurt, she said. You will, he answered, but not alone. The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows across the sandstone. A coyote called far off. She turned to him. Where are we going? He stirred the coals with a stick. There's a place east of the dragoons. A canyon with water year-round. My mother's people camped there before the army forced them west. It's quiet. Empty now. No one will follow us? They'd need a guide, he said. And there's no guide left who'd take their coin for it. Lorna rested her chin on her knees. You've carried so much I never saw. He shrugged lightly. You had your own burdens. She picked up a pine needle and rolled it between her fingers. When you found me, I was ready to be forgotten. I never forgot you, he said. She didn't answer, but her hand found his in the dirt and she laced her fingers through his. He didn't pull away. That night, she slept with her back to the earth and her cheek against his shoulder. At dawn, they moved again. The air sharpened with elevation and the scrub thinned to pinyon and juniper. Lorna's muscles stiffened from the cold, but she didn't complain. Setah stopped once to show her a broken hoof print near a dry arroyo. Mountain lion, he said. Is it close? Not anymore, he said. But it was watching. They crossed a narrow ridge where the land opened wide to the east. The sky there looked endless, softer than the harsh blue of the low deserts. Lorna pulled her shawl closer. I don't know who I am, Setah. Without the fort, without stitching wounds, without running. He didn't turn. You are who you choose to become now. She looked out over the rising land. Will you still want me once I stop being broken? His voice was low. I want you as you are. Not some future thing. They reached the canyon after sundown on the fifth day. Wind moved through the boulders like breath. Water trickled from a spring that ran through the base of the stone wall. The stars shone clear above, no smoke, no tents, no soldiers. Lorna stood still for a long time, listening. Setah unpacked the bedrolls and set them near the fire pit. There's a cave behind the spring. Dry. We can stay there until you're stronger. She walked to the edge of the spring and knelt. Her fingers touched the surface, and her reflection stared back hollow-eyed, but alive. He came to stand beside her. You're safe here. She rose, facing him. I don't want to hide forever. You won't, he said. But here you can begin. She looked up at him. And if I fall apart again, I'll be there when you do. She leaned into him then, her forehead against his chest, and for the first time since the gallows, she breathed without pain. The cave was cool and dry, tucked behind a curtain of sagebrush and stone. Over the next week, Lorna and Setah made it into something more than shelter. She gathered river reeds to weave a mat, while he lined the walls with cedar boughs to keep the damp from creeping in at night. They didn't speak much once the sun set, but each evening, after the fire was low and the canyon quiet, she would rest with her back against his chest, and he'd wrap his arm around her middle, palm splayed gentle across the fabric of her dress. One morning, she rose before him and stepped barefoot through the narrow cut in the rock toward the spring. The water caught the early light, and a pair of mule deer watched her from the far bank before bounding into the brush. She crouched down, touched the water with both hands, then stood and looked toward the trail that wound south. When she turned, Setah was there, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. I was only looking, she said, brushing a strand of hair back. I wasn't thinking of leaving. I know. She came closer, voice quiet. Do you ever miss what came before all this? Before the army? Before everything burned down? Setah looked toward the cottonwoods. I miss the sound of my grandmother grinding corn against the metate. I miss the sharp smell of smoke in her hair. I miss the way the old men used to sit in a circle and not speak for long stretches, like silence was a kind of food. They walked back together, not touching. She glanced at him once. I miss the sound of pages turning. Before the war, my father taught me to read by candlelight. After he died, I kept the habit, reading by whatever light I could find, even if it was just moonlight through a tent flap. What did you read? Medical texts? Scripture? A book of poems he gave me once. I didn't understand half of them, but I kept reading anyway. Setah smiled faintly, the first she'd seen since they arrived. You still have them? She shook her head. No. They burned my trunk when I was accused. Said I had no further need of personal property. Setah's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to the fire and stirred the coals for morning heat. Later, they walked together to a sandstone outcrop that caught the sun. Lorna carried a small satchel stitched from the sleeve of her old uniform. Inside were the dried herbs Setah had shown her how to gather yucca root, wild mint, and juniper berry. She laid them out on the rock and began sorting them with careful fingers. You learn quickly, he said. She glanced up. You taught me well. He sat beside her, elbows on his knees. What will you do with them? Steep them, make teas, salves, clean wounds, if the need ever comes. There was a pause before she added, I'd like to help others again, not under orders, just because I know how. Setah nodded slowly. Then we'll find a way. They spent the afternoon reinforcing the cave entrance before monsoon season came. Lorna tied bundles of reeds with sinew while Setah shaped a windbreak from flat stones. As they worked, a hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding across the rock. When the last stone was placed, she sat back and wiped her brow. You've built things before. He stacked the leftover rocks into a low circle. Once helped my uncle raise a winter hut near the Mimbres River. Took us 2 weeks. He said if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing slow and right. She reached for her canteen. I think I'd have liked him. He would have liked you. He didn't speak English, but he understood people better than most who do. That night, as they lay beside the fire, Lorna turned toward him in the dark. "Why did you stay with the scouts even after everything they did to your people?" He was quiet for a long while. "Then, I stayed to protect what little I could. If I rode with them, I could steer them away from sacred places. Warn families before they were found." She touched his hand. "And you risked being hated for it. By both sides." He didn't answer, but his fingers curled around hers. She shifted closer, laying her head just beneath his chin. "You've spent so long watching out for others," she whispered. "Let me watch out for you now." His breath was steady. "I wouldn't know how to let someone do that." She pressed a kiss to the hollow of his throat. "Then we'll learn together." In the stillness, he ran his hand through her hair, slow and careful, and they stayed like that until morning, tangled in each other and the quiet promise of beginning again. The rains came late that season. For nearly a week, the sky pressed low and gray over the canyon, and the damp crept into their clothes, their hair, their bones. Water pooled in shallow basins along the stone flats, and the spring rose thick and fast, curling through the rocks like it had something to prove. Setah had fashioned a lean-to from pinyon limbs and old canvas he'd once traded for a sharpened flint. Kept most of the rain off, but not all. Lorna stayed close to the fire, stitching a torn hem from an old shirt he'd found buried in his saddlebag. Her fingers fumbled more than usual. The cold made her clumsy. "You're shaking," Setah said, crouching low beside her. "I'm fine," she answered, though her teeth knocked together once before she could stop them. He reached behind her and pulled a second blanket from the cave. "Fine people don't sound like they're freezing through their spine." She laughed despite herself. "You always did have a way of listening too closely. I was taught to pay attention." She wrapped the blanket tighter as he sat beside her, pressing his shoulder lightly to hers. The fire hissed as another drop fell from the canvas overhead. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked, eyes on the flames. "Next? After this canyon? After the cold? After being hunted? What kind of life we could make?" Setah shifted to face her. "I've thought about carving a field from the soft ground east of here, where the soil stays black and wet all summer. There's a bend in the wash that holds good fish. A man could build something there. With what tools? I've got 2 hands. And time." She glanced sideways. "And what would you plant? Corn? Beans? Maybe squash if the deer don't find it first." She let that settle. "You'd live slow like that?" "I would," he said, "if I wasn't living alone." Her hand found his knee through the blanket. "I want that too. But I don't know if I can live slow. Not really. Not after the way I've run." "You don't have to go slow," he said. "Just steady." The rain eased toward evening and the clouds began to thin. They stepped out beside the spring where steam clung to the stones and the earth smelled fresh and raw. Lorna let her hair down, combing her fingers through the damp strands. "I used to think everything worth having had to be fought for," she said. "But this place, it asks for something different." Setah stood behind her, hands in his pockets. "It asks for patience." She turned to him slowly. "You've given me more than that. You gave me the space to stop running." He reached up and touched her cheek, thumb grazing just below her eye. "And you gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time." "What's that?" "Home." Her eyes welled, but she didn't look away. "Will you build that field?" "I will." "Then let me plant it with you." He bent just enough to press his mouth to hers, gentle, sure. She kissed him back without hesitation, her hands sliding up his arms, steadying herself. When they pulled away, neither spoke. There was no need. Later, they lay together on the woven mat, the fire low, the cave walls warm with the day's held heat. Lorna rested her head against Setah's chest, listening to the rhythm beneath his skin. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. He curled his fingers through hers. "Then we've already begun." The last snow melted into the canyon floor by late March, leaving behind a swell of green unlike anything Lorna had ever seen in the low country. The dormant brush burst into bloom, tiny, stubborn flowers clinging to stone cracks and dry ledges. Setah taught her to walk lightly across the thawing ground, how to read the way the soil shifted underfoot when it was ready to hold seed. They cleared a patch near the stream where the light lingered longest. Lorna used the spine of a broken mule deer antler to dig her furrows. When she paused to push her hair out of her face, Setah passed her a strip of calico to tie it back. "Do you still remember the names?" he asked, kneeling beside her with a bundle of dried pods. She pressed a kernel into the earth. "Every one you told me." He nodded once. "The white one is for early season. Red for later. Don't mix them." She grinned. "I won't." By the time the sun dropped behind the bluff, the field held 3 neat rows, marked with river stones. Lorna rubbed the dirt from her palms and looked over the small plot, chest rising with quiet pride. They didn't speak on the way back to the cave, but when they reached the entrance, Setah paused and looked at her, something undecided in his expression. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low. "When the harvest comes, I want to build a house. Just a small one. With a real roof and a door that opens when you push it, not when the wind says so." She stepped closer. "What kind of house?" "One with a chimney. A room to sleep, maybe another to work. I thought we could find lumber west of the canyon, near the dry cottonwood stand." She touched his sleeve. "I'd help you build it." "I was hoping you'd say that." In April, a letter arrived. A rider passed through the high ridge trails, an old man with a battered hat and a sore-footed mule. He stopped to rest near the spring and shared a tin of coffee in exchange for a warm fire. Lorna recognized the military seal on the envelope before she ever opened it. Setah watched her from across the fire, brow unreadable. She unfolded the paper, read it once, then folded it again. "They've cleared my name," she said simply. He didn't move. "And?" "They want me back. Fort Whipple. There's a new medical station being built. They say I'd have full say over it." She held the paper out to the flames and let it catch. The letter curled black and crumbled into the dust. "I'm not going back," she said. Setah looked at her for a long moment. "Are you sure? I've stitched wounds in tents and cellars and under gunfire. I've done what I could for people who never once looked me in the eye. But out here, I learned to breathe again. I don't want to give that up. Not for walls and orders." He reached across the fire and took her hand, not in question, but in answer. The days grew longer. They hunted rabbits near the ridgeline, traded dried herbs and tallow with the old rider when he passed through again, and gathered flat stones for the foundation of the house. Setah carved beams with a hatchet and his pocket knife, smoothing the edges with river grit. Lorna sanded the boards with wool scraps until her fingers ached. One morning, she stood in the doorway of the half-built house, the frame casting long shadows across the ground. She turned to Setah, who was repairing a pitch-lined joint near the roofline. "I never thought I'd live in a place I helped make," she said. He didn't look down. "You didn't help. You made it." She smiled. "Then I suppose you're just living in my house." He laughed once, rare and warm. "Then I'll be careful not to track mud inside." That night, they slept inside the frame, a canvas draped over the beams to keep the wind out. Lorna lay under the stars, her head on Setah's arm, the scent of juniper smoke still clinging to her hair. "I used to think love was a thing you had to chase," she said. "And now I think it's something you plan and wait for." Setah didn't answer, but he drew her closer, and she knew he understood. By midsummer, the corn stood waist high, and Lorna pressed her fingers to the husks with reverence. She worked beside Setah every day, hands calloused and sure. They roofed the house with cedar shingles and built shelves from salvaged crates. She carved a place for her herbs near the window where the light fell best. One evening, as the air cooled and the sky turned copper, Setah pulled a narrow strip of leather from his pocket. At its center sat a single piece of turquoise, polished smooth. "My grandmother wore this when she was married," he said. "She told me to give it when I found someone who made the world quiet." Lorna's breath caught as he tied it gently around her wrist. "I don't have papers or a priest," he said, "but I know what I want. And I think you do too." She took his face in her hands, eyes steady. "I want this. You. Every quiet morning, every storm. I won't run from it." He kissed her then, long and true, and the wind through the canyon whispered like water over stone. Years passed. The field grew, and so did their life. A second room was added to the house, then a small corral for a pair of goats they bartered from a traveling peddler. In time, neighbors came, other quiet souls who wanted something slower, something earned. Lorna tended their fevers and midwifed their births. Setah hunted with the boys and taught them to listen to the land. They grew old without noticing, until one spring morning, Lorna found herself watching the light shift across the floorboards and thought only this: I am where I was meant to be. That night, as she laid her head against Setah's shoulder, he wrapped his arm around her like he had from the beginning. You still sure? He asked softly. She smiled, eyes closed. Always.